Well, hello everybody, and welcome back, hopefully suitably recaffeinated. I'm John Godfrey, I'm the MD for Public Affairs Policy and Economic Research at TheCityUK, and this session, which is a regular high point of our conferences, will be an examination of the trust and reputation of the financial services industry in the eyes of the public and policymakers across the UK. So we're lucky again to have on the stage Dr. Carol McNaughton Nicholls, who's the managing partner at Think's Insight and Strategy. Think's Insight specialize in providing insight-based market research, and they do that work for CEOs, for boards, for ministers, for secretaries of state. Their work is valued hugely and highly respected, so we're lucky to have them. We've worked with Carol for 10 years, and her team have conducted research around trust and reputation throughout that time, which is always fed back to our board and to our members, and which adds value to what we do. Carol's presented on this subject at this conference in Bristol, Edinburgh, Manchester, Birmingham, and so this is her 5th outing, and I think she did the online conference that was done from here, or theoretically done from here during COVID. So Carol is an absolute stalwart of this work, and she is recognized as having tracked and provided insight in financial services for more than 15 years and is one of the leading practitioners in this space in the UK. She works for the Financial Conduct Authority, the Lending Standards Board, UK Finance, the ABI, the Finance and Leasing Association, numerous other financial firms. So it's a specialist subject for her. She began her career in academia and still regularly conducts research looking at changing cultural, political, technological, social trends, including specifically the impact this has on financial behaviors, reputation and trust. So she'll take us through her presentation first. You can store up questions. We will then have a good discussion about her findings and her conclusions and what we think is the direction of travel. So please prepare your questions, ask them, use the app, or we can do it again by raising a hand at the appropriate moment. So let's have lots of audience participation in this really interesting subject. So Carol, over to you.
Thank you, John. Thank you for that very kind introduction. Good morning. It's always, as I say, a real pleasure to be here every year. The conference is always towards the end of November, so I also always know it's time to start my Christmas shopping when I do this conference. So it's great to be here today again and talking through, as I said, industry reputation. Now, I do have quite a few slides, and the slides have quite a lot of detail on them and some statistics and direct quotes from the policymakers that we interview, and I'll talk through the methodology in a moment. Please don't worry if you cannot see the details. I believe they may already be on the app. If not, they are always uploaded to the website after the conference. So there's probably lots of interesting content you'd like to read after this presentation. I will just go through it at a top level, but you can access it and read those details, so don't worry about squinting today. So in terms of the approach we took to research, now, I won't go through this in a lot of detail. You may not all be people who are really involved in the details of research, but I do think it's important you know where these results come from. And every year we conduct the same methodology, and we interview 20 policymakers. And these are narrative interviews, so one-on-ones. We chat with them. It's not sort of structured multiple choice questions. It's a real conversation with policymakers. We always make sure that we have a spread of different party affiliations. We include senior stakeholders from regulatory organisations, as well as MPs and those in the House of Lords. So that's the core of the feedback, is these interviews around their perception of the finance and related professional services industry and how that relates to their policy priorities. We also couple with that an online survey of over 2,000 members of the UK public, and that's where some of the statistics you'll see come from. If there's a picture of the UK on the slide, that's the stats from the public versus the Parliament there from policymakers. So that's the figures that you'll see, and this is nationally representative of region, age, and gender across the UK. And we've been asking the same questions for many years, so you'll see how we can track sentiment over time. Now, I think it's almost not worth saying, but it is an important really context to remember, there is a lot going on, and policymakers' views are coloured by all of these issues that are going on. Put it another way, they're busy people with a lot on their plate. yes, there's been a lot of discussion around growth in industry. We do these interviews sort of from April to around August each year. So this year we finished them around August. So there was obviously things around Trump's tariffs were happening. There's sort of geopolitical instability. Immigration, I also work at the Home Office, and immigration has become this huge, huge issue now for the public and politically. So there's a lot going on. And in that context of policymakers, the industry is not necessarily always front of mind. It may be very important, but they are juggling a lot, and it's in that context we also need to understand where they're coming from their position around the industry. Now, perhaps slightly depressingly as well, this is actually from our own Mood of the Nation work that we do a couple of times a year. Slightly depressingly, when we asked the UK public how optimistic or pessimistic they feel about the UK today, we found that since we started tracking this in 2019, optimism is lower today than when we began measuring it. Now, you can see this uptick here was actually the general election last year, but sadly it is now dropped to the lowest since then. So the context is not wrong for policymakers that it's a really difficult time. The public are feeling pessimistic as well. They are also feeling it. So I'm going to talk through 4 key findings related to this research on reputation. I'll go through each one of these in turn, so I won't go through this at the moment, but just so you can see where we're going with it. The first one, now, we were talking, John and I were talking about this last week. I'm sorry, this must now be the understatement of 2025. But when we conducted this research last year, I was doing the interviews last summer. We did some interviews before and after the general election because we didn't actually quite know when the general election was going to begin when we started them. There was a real, genuine, palpable sense, whatever the party affiliation of the policymakers I interviewed, at least now, last year, we're going to have a period of stability. We're going to have a plan for the next 4 years. Even this summer, I interviewed quite a few sort of new Labour MPs. There was still a sense, right, we need a plan. We're going to need to have stability. We're going to try and get there. It just feels now like really that sort of post-election stability has certainly not materialised. Well, let's see where we can go next year with that. But we asked policymakers what their own personal goals are. What do they want to achieve? If there were new MPs, for example, what are they trying to achieve in their time here? And it's cost of living, as we've already heard this morning. They're thinking about their constituents. Cost of living, immigration, these are huge issues. Net zero came up again too. That's the sort of national goals. But at a local level, they're thinking about their constituents' opportunities, employment, place. We hear people being increasingly concerned about antisocial behaviour, about living and being in a place that they feel is thriving. That they feel also where they can afford homes and houses, and so like house building and people's access to the things that matter to them in their day-to-day lives are the priorities for policymakers. And they probably have their own polls and do their own polling, because they're not wrong. We polled the public as well around what priorities do they want to see the government focusing on. And it's very similar. Improving the cost of living is number one. But then immigration is a really key issue that just really come up with salience this year. For better or worse, I think there's a lot more heat than light on the topic, but it's really excising the public, and we're seeing so many divisions around it. And then beyond that, we always hear things like the NHS and waiting times, the UK economy, as I mentioned, crime, antisocial behaviour. These are the things the public also want the government to focus on. So they do have a lot they're having to focus on. But the economy is in there. The economy is really important. And in doing interviews with policymakers, although there was some difference between parties, wherever they were their start point, most do feel concerned about the economic future of the UK. They recognise a growing revenue gap. They recognise that some measures that may be taken to address that, when we were doing these interviews over the summer, for example, talking about rising business rates, may have a backfire effect. There doesn't seem to be an easy or straightforward way out of this, but there's a real need to focus on the economy and a feeling that there has to be a clearer course, but nobody's actually entirely clear on what that course should look like. So that's the context that we're in at the moment. But I would say, okay, I'm sorry if that's a little depressing as a start point. Despite this wider financial and political instability, and perhaps because of it to some extent, the industry itself, the finance and related professional services industry, continues to be perceived relatively positively. You're seen to be organised and well-structured, and I think in the face of so much sort of chaos around them, doing fairly well. Each year, we ask policymakers and the public the words they would associate with the industry. And the largest word cloud are the words for this year, and the smaller ones are from the previous 2 years. And you can see on the side with the parliamentarians and the policymakers, it's sort of generally quite positive terminology. This year, the same as in previous years. Important, global, diverse. Fragmented, there are some other, perhaps less complementary issues coming up, but overall, fairly positive sentiment. And we see, similarly with the public, I think they see the industry really in quite functional terms. How can it support them? How can it help them? And sort of money comes through as being important, which is to them what it's about and what it's covering and how they manage their money. So we've seen, I think, a move away from particularly negative sentiments since 2008. And that shows that it's actually doing okay. Now, there's a lot going on in these slides. As I say, you can see the detail online. But basically, this is the tracking statistics from each year, where we ask the public how favorably they feel towards my own bank. This is the one closest to me. My own bank, then my insurance provider, then banks and banking in the UK, financial service industry in the UK, law firms, insurance providers in the UK, and goes down to investment managers. The darkest line is this year, going back for other years. And you can see there's a tiny drop this year in terms of percentage point that are favourable. But actually, I think a little bit, it's like we did this polling just after the general election last year. There was a bit of an optimism bounce, as I say. So I think this is actually quite flat. A couple of percentage points isn't a really significant shift. So it's fairly flat. And we always see this story that the public feel more positive towards their own bank, their own insurance providers. That's where they have their touch points. Now, in theory, they are also banks and banking in the UK. It's not that different, and they're less favourably thought of. But that's because I think that's in their day-to-day touch points, who they're interacting with, who they're engaging with. So I don't think it's a particularly negative picture, given we live in a time of fairly low trust, that we have sort of 64% saying there's sort of favourability towards their own bank. And we also see trust. We do ask about trust and favourability. Trust has also remained fairly static. We can see sort of some increases even, but in a couple percentage point decrease. As I say, from research terms, we'd really call this fairly flat. And we looked particularly, because we have regional splits as well, we looked at Yorkshire and Humbersides, and the trust levels there is pretty similar to that of the general population, to that of the UK. 63% trust their own bank, 42% banks and banking. It does show there could be a way to go, because conceptually, trust isn't that high for the banks and banking, but actually, there's a relatively, I'd say, high level of trust in their own bank, and regionally that bears out here as well. Now, policymakers also continue to hold the industry in high regard and feel it has a central role to play in the industrial strategy. So we hear these narratives from policymakers year on each year, and I think they do also chime with the narratives that TheCityUK promote as well. We hear language from policymakers that the industry drives the economy. It's a large export. We hear this each year, and I think that's a really strong and positive message. This year, interestingly, perhaps because of the geopolitical instability and some of the things that were happening coming out of the US as we were doing these interviews, we also heard there's an opportunity now to potentially bring some business back to the UK, because we are actually still seen as relatively stable, and that we need to be sort of jumping on that opportunity. A few years ago, there was some fear that we'd lose out to other nations post-Brexit, but actually a feeling now that there's an opportunity that we're still seen as a fairly strong and stable industry here in the UK. So fairly positive perceptions from policymakers, and the public kind of agree. They're not as engaged. These grey lines here are where they just don't have an opinion. They say they don't know. So I put that in because it shows there's a fairly high level of agreement to statements such as financial and related professional service companies in the UK bring valuable income to the UK economy. That's the top one. Now, 63% agree with that. But we kept the grey bar in to show you the flip side isn't people disagree. The flip side is they're just not that engaged. A much higher proportion don't have an opinion. So the UK public are also kind of on board with the fact the industry brings valuable income to the UK economy. The second one talks about when financial and related professional service companies do well, the UK and the UK economy benefits. So they're on board with some of these narratives. That said, there is always room to improve. There is still scope to improve. And an interesting insight we learned this year is, of course, there are many new MPs. If we think about last year's sort of general election, a really large cohort of new MPs came into being. We interviewed many of them this year. And there is still some lack of knowledge and a lack of engagement with the industry. There's this interesting new cohort, and some of them held more traditional negative views. So there is a sense there is still some work to be done. And even those who are more expert in the industry, some of the regulators that I interviewed, for example, called out that there is some degree of fragmentation, perhaps oversupply. There are still things to work on with the industry. Although it's broadly positive and an important part of the UK economy, that doesn't mean we can all just relax and go home. There's plenty to be done to continue improving processes and thinking about that. And what was particularly called out was, we've heard, for example, when I was doing the interviews not long after the Mansion House speech, is thinking about guiding deregulation and, as we've heard today, encouraging retail investing. I do a lot of work with the FCA, actually, on encouraging retail investing and targeted support. And the policymakers are also recognising this importance of educating the public, of thinking about how we can harness investment to support the economy, and also the industry having a role to play in helping to educate and guide on what actually responsible deregulation could look like, and a need for this. There is, I think, really increased recognition that though some regulation may have been put in place with the best will, it's created an unintended consequence that now is really driving a need for deregulation to free up opportunities for investment and growth, and that comes through from policymakers as well. That said, I did mention some hold more, I'd say, sort of traditionally negative views about the industry, and that may come from them feeling they lack connection with the industry. So one Labour MP I interviewed, for example, talks about, when I said, how would you describe the industry? Untrustworthy, speculation, tax avoidance. I wish I was saying investment, but I'm not. There's never any investment if there's anything going on in my ends. So whilst there was broadly some positive feedback, there is also, some of those more negative sentiments out there. However, those that I interviewed who were newer and less engaged with the industry also recognised, many of them, that their perception was changing as they learnt more. And this is quite a long quote, which I can read out specifically here. It's one that I interviewed, a different Labour MP that I interviewed. And this kind of gets into the mindset of where some policymakers are coming from, particularly when they're in a sort of new position. They've talked about how their perceptions changed. So it's different when you're a day-to-day person. You're doing your online banking. They're just a normal person out there engaging through their banking. And you're going through your own lens. You're only going off what you hear from the media. It's different when you're going to organisations and you see the impact of the finance sector on the UK. You see how beneficial it is and how we should be nurturing it further and accelerating it. You start thinking about how we can help people who are suffering from the cost of living crisis, how we want to properly fund public services, and you realise you need the financial service sector to grow and accelerate to get this money. I've got better insight of how everything works together, and that's definitely changed my opinion. So there is a job to be done to help support, educate some of these audiences, and they can be supported to think differently about the importance of the industry if their start point is one that is not so positive, although many do come from a positive start point. And of course, TheCityUK love me also commenting on the fact some of them mentioned that they'd heard from the TheCityUK, which was very helpful. That it is a way about thinking, how do we reach these people? How do we help provide the information that they need for them to have those stories around how the industry can benefit their local areas, their constituents? So on that final section, policymakers' perspectives are enhanced by key messages about growth, about employment and investment. They do have high expectations. They want the industry to achieve a lot. They're hoping, I think, that the industry can achieve a lot, but these messages can make a huge difference to them and to bringing them along on their perception of the industry. They want to see the industry supporting UK SMEs, and we've heard about that this morning, the importance of SMEs, and that comes through from policymakers as well. This Labour MP spoke about all of the companies in my constituency are SMEs. It's like 900 of them. I want investment in the productive industries that create good jobs in my constituency. So that's the types of message we're hearing from policymakers they want to hear from the industry. We also heard about investment in UK defence companies and a recognition that some of these are also SMEs. And in supporting them, you are supporting SMEs, you're supporting the UK economy. And quite a bullish sense from some policymakers that we are just going to have to invest in defence given the sort of geopolitical instability that we live in at the moment, but also recognising that as an investment in UK SMEs if it is done in the UK. Other narratives that are important to policymakers are those around regional investment, and that's why this conference today is so important. They want to hear how real opportunities are being driven for their constituents, real opportunities and jobs that will actually help their constituents, and messages and narratives around that are so important because actually often those stories They are being told, but how do they reach the right people the right way? Stories are the way in which people can really remember stats and I think believe in those stats. And they need to often be highly localized and relevant to their constituents. And the public agree, they would like to see the industry focus on providing employment and contributing to regional growth. These figures, so the top line is encouraging more financial and related professional service companies to open offices in my area would be a good thing. 50% agree with that, and only a third sort of have no strong opinion on it. So they also want to think that there's jobs and opportunities. Financial and related professional service companies help create high-paying jobs outside London. That's the second one. And you can see sort of fairly high proportion agreeing with that, and about a third sort of indifferent to that. But they agree with what it is that the policymakers also want to hear. So there's high expectations beyond some of these themes. Policymakers also recognise there's a need to think about net zero, infrastructure, promoting UK PLC. So I'm afraid there's a lot to be done. But it's an interesting time of opportunity. Just to recap, supporting SMEs, driving growth, keeping homegrown business in the UK through innovation and investment, supporting UK defence and boosting employment and local investment. These are the narratives that policymakers want to hear about. I will just close in some reflections of overall implications. We started by talking about the fact there is really growing uncertainty and concern about the future, both in the UK and globally. And this can actually distract from messages about the industry. There is a lot going on. But ultimately, however, as we've seen from the Labour MP whose view had changed, there is recognition the industry will be vital in supporting the UK economy and helping to move on from these uncertain times. I think having now conducted this research for many years, and every year we say maybe things will get better next year, there is this sense, like, do policymakers themselves believe that the UK can thrive? How are we going to get there? It's a noisy, uncertain landscape. There are many challenges ahead, but the industry is seen as really vital in being able to step up and help support driving a better economy, driving a better UK for everyone. So with that, I'll hand over to questions and a bit of a challenge to you all around how can you be part of that change.
Carol, thank you very much. That was that was an absolute tour de force, as we've come to expect from you, and you did not disappoint. The big takeaway for me from that was that views of policymakers can change for the positive following engagement. So the message to everybody, I think, is engage. We've got quite a few questions coming in, and I'll go first to this one, which you talked a bit about the regional aspects of what we do. How can we better illustrate the contribution and success of the industry beyond the M25 and overcome that perception that we're sort of heavily London and South East based?
Yeah, it's a lot of ongoing challenge, isn't it? But I think, as I mentioned, I do a lot of work on sort of effective communication development with my clients as well. And storytelling is really important. Statistics can be important, and I think for people who are maybe quite numbers-minded in this room, we think we want the hard facts, the statistics, but actually the stories, the individual stories and narratives are really important for also engaging people. So stories of how the industry is providing, as I say, real tangible opportunities at a local level, at a constituent level, or investing in something such as house building, but not just we're investing in house building, but we're investing in this house building that's happening there, that's going to these people in your local area, and a story of why that's necessary. I think these types of narratives are much more effective in people understanding how the industry is actually making a difference outside of London. But it's not easy because it does have to be quite nuanced and localised. It's not a story of sort of Glasgow you're telling in Leeds. It's like what's actually happening around Leeds that matters to people.
Yeah, and it's humanising it, isn't it?
Absolutely.
This is the house that somebody lives in. And
Absolutely,
this is the person that lives in it, and this is the organisation that funded it. So absolutely. And a topical one now, a different subject, which is, we heard from Raoul Ruparel earlier that the budget yesterday was a budget for markets, for Labour backbenchers. Was it a budget for the public as well?
Honestly, I think for the public, it may just be a bit meh. There was a lot going on and a lot of things that looked actually like they will impact the public in quite small ways, either sort of negatively if they're paying a little bit more or positively. Maybe if they have 3 children and they get child benefit, maybe that's benefiting some. Maybe if someone drives an EV, they'll be a bit annoyed. But I didn't see much that the public, I think, would really feel very strongly about one way or the other. I think, so we were discussing earlier actually, what it may come down to is the narrative that emerges in the media around it and which of those narratives takes hold. I think for the public, it's hard to see whether there's anything there that would really will make them feel very different. In that respect, it's fairly safe, because they probably won't make them feel hugely more negative towards what the government's doing. But as we saw from the polling earlier, they really want public services to be fixed. The NHS, they want crime and social behaviour addressed, all these things. And I don't know where we're seeing the income for that from the budget either. So that's the sort of proof of the pudding, when the public will start to have more trust in what the government's doing.
Yeah, and if the budget itself, as you described it, is a bit meh, do you think there's an impact from the very bouncy run-up to the budget? Because that's something that a lot of our members have said, hang on, this is terrible for decision-making, for confidence, for a sense that the grown-ups are in charge. Is that damaging?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're maybe the average person on the street, because I do a lot of also like interviewing and research with people about how they manage their finances day to day. So we talk lots of people, what news have you seen recently, things like that. So the average person on the street probably wasn't even aware that anything new came out of the budget, because they'd all heard it all before being debated over the last few weeks. So I think it's really hard to say whether it got any real cut through, because it's been talked about endlessly what might happen, and some of it is what happened for so long. I think that probably diminished the impact and cut through it could have.
Yeah, I'm sure that's right, because it was a pretty confusing few months to go through. And by the way, please don't just send them in on the app. Please do put hands up if anyone's got questions from the audience. But we've got a different one here, which is I think, is a really interesting question, Carol, which is from Nicholas Greenwood. He says, when the AI bubble bursts and there is a downfall in the UK stock market, do you think the public will lose trust in the financial sector like in 2008? Or has there been enough positivity that people will still back financial services?
I mean,
quite a big question.
It is. We don't have a crystal ball, unfortunately, do we? I think it might be a little bit different than 2008, but as always, it will depend, if this bubble does burst, how that impacts people in their own real lives. Does it actually impact, their income, their pension pot, their ability to do things? As we talked already about sort of stories, is it going to create pain in their lives? And I think that's where, if it does, it could damage the industry reputation. I think the public have really moved on from this perception post-2008, where if I used to do a focus group with the public and talk about, finances and banks, they're all just fat cat bankers. We've really moved on from that. There's not that attitude now at all, particularly with the new generation coming up. They're much more tech savvy. Now, everyone's managing their money through digital, apps. I mean, I know there's a small cohort who are vulnerable that can't, but generally most people, it's a great service. They engage well with their providers of financial services, and that makes all the difference to the reputation of the industry. So if there is a kind of the bubble bursts, I think that it will really come down to how it affects them on an individual level, what the impact it has, or it may just be seen as quite abstract if it doesn't.
Yeah. It's an interesting observation, and we talked about it a little bit last year, that the climb back in reputational and trust terms since the global financial crisis has been pretty gradual. And a comment from the audience has observed that the word clouds change, but they change quite slowly over time. So it takes a long time to claw back, and it's quite easy to drop quickly. But the clawing back, is that because really people are forgetting about 2008, 2009, and there's a new generation engaging with banks, and they're better at dealing with banks through technology?
Absolutely, I think so. I think it's really important for the industry that they do engage with the views of the younger generation. For some of the younger generation, it's not even that they've forgotten. They were never sort of around in 2008, or they were children around then, so it's just not on their radar. As I say, the rise of digitization and the way in which the younger generation engages with their money, but also things like investing, is really different from even like my generation. And often when we do research, we look at it by sort of generational cohorts. So I think we've got this new generation coming up who think very differently of the industry, think very different of things like investment and what it means for them, may lack some kind of education, may still need some support around that. But I think a really interesting group to understand now and to think about how you can engage and support now, because there's some really new, interesting opportunities with them. And they're not kind of tainted with concerns of what happened in 2008. It wasn't even maybe part of their life. And instead they see the industry as an industry of opportunity. They see an industry where they are much more comfortable with investing than previous generations, as I say. It's kind of what you do with that, I think, is going to really matter going forward.
Yeah. Does that mean we have to understand, how you communicate through TikTok and
all
of those types of things? I mean, I would love to know, but I'm assuming it does. It just means we have to modernize.
Yeah, although there's a bit of a watch out, isn't there, as well, when we do this research with the younger generation, that there's a lot of stuff on TikTok that isn't particularly useful or good. It's how you kind of help them to cut through that, because we see that, again, the younger generation, they rely more on unregulated sources, friends and families, online influencers, and some of that is not information you want them to be relying on. They're getting into crypto, all these types of things. So yes, I think it's about understanding them and their needs and mindsets, and also them seeing the industry as a place they might want to work and make their careers, and getting that talent across different regions as well. Making sure for these young people they see there is a path, there is an opportunity for them there, not just for their investing, but as a career path, because that's how you're going to get that kind of great new talent who see the industry already in different ways. And they'll naturally know how to communicate with other people of their cohort and what they need.
Yeah, the talent bit is massively important, isn't it? I mean, my limited experience of TikTok is it's mainly about cats playing musical instruments. But never mind that. We'll have a slight change of direction, and there's a really interesting question, which is about the increase both here and internationally in what you would call populist politics. Firstly on the right, and now also on the left with your party and Zach Polanski's Greens. And the polling that we've seen as a board at the City UK sort of conflates that and with a sense that some people have that nothing is working and they're quite grumpy about it. It's more that than a sort of straight up and down ideological thing. How might the industry respond to this populism wave?
That is quite an interesting question, isn't it? And there's a few parts to it. And when we did this polling, there was a sort of slide I flipped over because there's a lot on it. We do know how people voted in the last election, so we could look at their sort of perception of trust in the industry by who they voted for. Now, the slight drawback to that is that's changed. If we now look at voter intention in the future, that the numbers have really changed in terms of who they vote for. We just have who they actually did in the past. But what we saw there is there's slightly less trust and favourability among those who voted Green or Reform, but it's not that different. There are still members of the public when it comes to how they perceive the industry. I think it'd go back to the point that for many of the public and the rise of populism, it is this sense of lacking agency, of things just not working for them. And actually, as an industry, if you can help things work for them, make their life easier, through even like customer service, the apps they access, the way they manage their money, that will do something in helping them to feel the industry, is okay, it's working okay. And a little kind of an analogy, I did some research particularly on sort of big corporate brands and people's perceptions of them, included like Amazon recently, with different sort of political affiliations people had. And even people who are like, oh, no, I don't support Amazon, I don't support what they do, but I mean, I buy stuff with them, they're really convenient, it's great. So I think there's also this disjuncture, like if you provide a good service and they are engaging well, as you saw, much more favourability and trust to your own bank. So actually getting it right on those touch points that people are engaging with day to day can help them feel maybe I am a bit in control, maybe things are working for me here. And I think could negate some of the negativity around the more broader sort of policy context that may kind of run counter to that. And there's so much division. People are so used to it. Everyone's a critic now, but then I think people are beginning to tune out all that. So if you do good by people themselves, I think that helps them feel good about you.
I think that hooks back, doesn't it, a little bit to the whole question about SMEs and the importance of that in the polling, because certainly other polling that we've seen, suggests there's a sort of conflation between the establishment political parties and big business, whereas what we really like is the local entrepreneur that we know round the corner who's doing their best to make a business fly, and do we focus enough on them? So I think. I think that's a really helpful observation. But I'll come to a question from Maria Arias, who says, in a fast-paced and changing environment, how can we find consistent progress on critical themes for regional growth?
That's a very difficult question.
It's a tough one, isn't it? but you're the best person to try it. You know.
I mean, is it sort of themes on regional growth? I mean, it is. I'm a broken record talking about storytelling, and I think it's like, I mean, what you all actually do in a policy level, what you all actually invest in is beyond my research. That has to come to the decisions of the people who are kind of making those investment decisions and hoping they're the right decisions that's going to help create the positive stories that you can talk about regionally. And knowing that region is really important, because where the opportunity lies and what's a positive story can be different by different regions. So it's beyond my research to say what the right decision is, but I do think it's really important that people around the table sort of making those investment decisions for their local area are clear on what's going to be right for their area and where the opportunities are. You know, I mean, one MP I interviewed spoke a lot about manufacturing in her area and really seeking investment for manufacturing there. Others spoke about tech, AI, and innovation, sort of knowing and the others spoke about universities, you know, talent. So sort of knowing where the opportunities are in your regional areas and making those right decisions around investment and being able to develop those effective stories that are authentic and real, and you've really done it. I think that's key, and that's not easy. But I think it's key, and there's no one size fits all either. It's of knowing your region and what's going to be right for that region.
And presumably with the policymakers as opposed to the public, you know, a lot of it is about really compelling case studies which show how we've risen to the kind of challenges that Tracy Brabin covered earlier, and Tim Nunes and people from central and local government. Yeah. Can we just prove that we are a force for good in delivering what the public wants and their elected representatives?
Yeah, their constituents in particular.
Yeah.
You know, tell them a story of how you've helped the young people in their constituency, or there's some better jobs for their constituents. And it is a challenge though, because it can be very localised. Like one Labour MP I interviewed spoke about, you know, her constituents wouldn't sort of feel comfortable travelling 25 minutes on a train to the nearest sort of larger city. So if you tell a story of that city, it's like, that's not actually my constituents, that's that city nearby. So it requires some granular storytelling, and maybe it won't always work everywhere, but it's important and it can really make a difference.
Yeah, I mean, and MPs are very constituency focused, and one of the things we do is we can write to them all and say the number of workers you have in your constituency in the financial and related professional services industry is 7,000 or 12,000 or whatever it may be. And I remember talking to Nicky Morgan, former MP now in the Lords, who said it was one of the most impactful letters she had in her time in Parliament. So these things do land. So I would encourage that kind of granularity. So look, we're kind of coming broadly up to time, and I just wanted to come to another question here which has come in, which is in terms of policymaker attitudes, have you identified any advocacy opportunities for our industry that we're not pursuing at the moment? Where do we fall short?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think, again, coming back to like the individual stories mattering to them, other things I haven't touched on that I hear about as concerns that I think we should talk about is like addressing financial crime, addressing fraud, addressing pension fraud, anything you can doing around, again, how you're protecting the people, how you're protecting sort of integrity of our systems. I think they are also really important for policymakers to hear about and to advocate on what you are doing, because a huge amount is being done there. And that's the stories they sometimes hear of individuals who've experienced real detriment. So how you can counter that detriment to the individuals is also important to them.
Yeah, and sort of the flip side of that, you know, is there evidence that there are particular things we should be emphasising to ensure that the policymakers value financial and related professional services even more highly than they do? I think a lot of them do get it.
Yeah.
But, you know, is there more that we need to demonstrate? Do we need to be more granular, more broken up in sector?
I think it's those four key themes we talked about, you know, SMEs, investment, innovation, retaining UK success stories that are growing. There's a sense that sometimes they may have to go elsewhere for investment to scale. So telling stories of where you've been able to keep success stories in the UK and help them scale. So local stories you've mentioned already. So I think these really are the key things to really focus on, having a compelling narrative around.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And it was my observation when I was on the business side in the sector that, you know, governments were always very keen to trumpet direct investment from abroad, you know, but it was slightly taken for granted that the UK institutions would be doing it. So you got less of a fanfare as a UK institution. Now, of course, you need both, And I think, you know, it's incumbent on us to make sure that we do celebrate success and communicate success. But Carol, you know, as ever, it's hugely insightful to have you here on stage. We're enormously grateful for the work you do for us. And I would just remind everybody that the slides and the detail behind them is all available online. So please do follow up. And thank you very much, Carol. Can we just thank her in the usual way?